This is Lesson 24-4, Responding to Western Imperialism. What was the general pattern of non-Western responses to Western expansion? College Board Topic 7.7, Imperialism's Global Effects. Explain how European imperialism affected both European and non-European societies, especially as non-Europeans became educated in Western values. They challenged European imperialism through nationalist movements and by modernizing local economies and societies. Places, in particular, India, Japan, and China. Time frame, 1857 to 1911. Key concepts of responding to Western imperialism: the Great Rebellion, the Meiji Restoration, the 100 Days of Reform, the Boxer Rebellion, and the Hindu-Indian National Congress. Intro. Western expansion from the point of view of Africans and Asians. It was invasive, it was disruptive for local economies and for long-standing ways of life and for governments and for established beliefs and values, and it was aggravated by European power and arrogance. The weapons of the weak. Peasants and small farmers got the brunt of the persecution, and they had lots of passive ways to resist: working more slowly, hiding surplus crops, feigning ignorance about taxes. The determined anti-imperialist leaders. Colonized people often followed a dynamic leader to resistance. There were two reasons that those arose. Number one, a burning desire for dignity, economic freedom, and political independence. And number two, they had discovered European ideals. Things like civil liberties, political self-determination, nationalism especially, and Marxism after 1917. Three examples of major Asian countries that were inspired to resist Western imperialism by the Westerners' own thought and culture were China, India, and Japan. The empire in India. India was different from Africa and different from Japan and China. It had no independent government like China and Japan did. It was also a much older colony than those in Africa. The British East India Company had ruled in India for centuries, and they had deposed the last independent state in India in 1848. From 1857 to 1858, the Great Rebellion caused the British government to take over from the British East India Company. The British called this rebellion the Sepoy Mutiny, and it was made up of British-trained Indian military units, and it was crushed by bringing up more British-trained Indian military units. The British Parliament ruled in India until 1947. In 1900, less than 3,500 British officials governed a colony of over 300 million. The white elite was backed by white officers and indigenous troops. They practiced strict discrimination. They considered themselves to be racially superior to the indigenous people. The role of women in India. The Suez Canal made it more practical for British civil servants and businessmen to take their wives and children to India with them. Some women were missionaries and social reformers. They tried to improve the lives of native Indian peoples through education and through legislation. The civilizing mission in India. As we know, this was well-meaning, but still inspired by strong feelings of racial and cultural superiority. They also, and not just women, tried to improve the lives of native Indian peoples through education and through legislation. The British also needed an educated class of skilled subordinates. The British established a modern secondary school system for this purpose, and high-caste Hindus responded to the offer of education and advancement. The new Indian elite emerged. They worked to promote economic development, such as railroads, irrigation projects, communications, large plantations. Their efforts, however, did little to help the masses of India. Increased profits went to the British and the Indian elite. The British state in India. The British now had a well-educated, English-speaking Indian bureaucracy. They had made steps toward economic development, and they now had a unified, powerful state. All the various peoples of India were under the same laws. However, this Indian elite class ultimately responded to British rule with nationalism. Even the Indian elite were perpetually unequal to the white British. Many things were off limits to them. Certain clubs, top jobs, hotels, railroad cars. At the same time, they had been taught in these schools about human rights, social justice, and equality. British schools raised them to believe in representation and democracy while running India as a dictatorship. In 1885, this Indian elite class formed the Hindu Indian National Congress, and they began working for equality and self-rule. Britain had already granted this to Australia and Canada. In 1907, a radical faction within the Congress called for Indian independence. The example of Japan. The Japan that Commodore Matthew Perry encountered in 1853 looked like this: a complex feudal society, a weak figurehead of an emperor, a military governor had the real power, he was called the shogun, and a warrior nobility called the samurai enforced the rule of the shogun. Below them was a class of peasants and city dwellers. They were hardworking and productive. The samurai were humiliated by the sudden American dominance, and a wave of anti-foreign and anti-government terrorism and assassinations lasted from 1858 to 1863. Americans, Dutch, British, and French all sent warships to demolish key Japanese forts, and this weakened the power and the prestige of the shogun. The Meiji Restoration. This was a great turning point in Japanese history. In 1867, a group of samurai restored the emperor to full political power, and they halted all the anti-foreign attacks, and they initiated a series of catch-up modernization measures. And its battle cry was, enrich the state and strengthen the armed forces. Those were two key values. Question was, how? The Meiji government embarked on a new pathway toward freedom from foreign domination. They decided Western civilization was superior in some respects. It had military superiority, and it had industrial superiority. In 1871, the Meiji abolished old institutions that had been identified as holding back the Japanese people in a bloodless revolution. They abolished the feudal system, and they replaced it with a strong, centralized state. And they declared social equality for all, and they got rid of a legal system that had recognized 4 different classes. They recreated their economy. It became free, competitive, government stimulated, and they declared freedom of movement throughout the country. Traveling had been a crime before. They built new railroads and factories, and the result was a huge release of human energy. They created a powerful army and navy, and it was reorganized among European lines. It had a professional officer corps. They required 3 years of military service for all males. And they put down a feudal rebellion in 1877. In 1877, this new Meiji Imperial Army put down the Satsuma Rebellion. And this rebellion was staged by several thousand samurai who revolted because the Meiji modernization challenged their status as the privileged warrior class. The Tom Cruise movie, The Last Samurai, is based upon French officer Jules Brunet, who helped the samurai in the Satsuma Rebellion. The Meiji leaders got educated about other foreign advancements, such as science and technology, industry, medicine, education. They sent Japanese students to learn abroad, and they attracted foreign experts with large salaries to train Japanese leaders. They formed a new authoritarian state. It was based on the German Empire. It had a constitution. It gave the emperor and his ministers vast power, and there was a legislature with much less power. Finally, they became imperialist expansionists themselves. They used gunboat diplomacy to open Korea. They conquered the island of Formosa. They beat China in a war. They beat Russia in a war. And in 1910, they annexed Korea. They showed nationalists in other parts of Asia and Africa what could be achieved by a non-Western power. If you're a non-Western power, you could meet the foreign threat. You could beat a Western power at its own game. Toward revolution in China. The Qing dynasty seemed about to collapse in 1860. Then it experienced a 30-year upswing. The Empress Dowager Cixi, along with a corps of effective statesmen and generals, managed to quell the unrest. And they also managed to put down the long-standing and vast Taiping Rebellion. The Chinese got a bit of a break from destructive foreign aggression. European powers had attained their main goal in China. The Chinese government entered a period of limited cooperation with these powers. Then the Sino-Japanese War happened from 1894 to 1895. China lost badly, once again revealing its vulnerability to the West. Western powers took advantage, renewing their domination of China. In 1898, it looked like China could be partitioned just like Africa. However, the United States proposed an open-door policy, and the other European powers accepted. Attempts at radical reform. The young Emperor Guangzhou launched what was called 100 Days of Reform in 1898. His efforts competed with others who wanted to get rid of the dynastic system altogether and replace it with a republic. The Empress Dowager Cixi finally had the emperor imprisoned, and she replaced his officials with traditional reactionaries. The Boxer Rebellion. The Qing dynasty supported this violent rebellion in the year 1900. The rebellion was against Christians and foreigners. More than 200 foreigners were killed, and thousands of Chinese were killed. The Empress Dowager had declared war on all foreign powers. The Boxers laid siege to the Embassy Quarter of Beijing, and Western powers, including the U.S. and Japan, put together a 20,000-man military coalition, and they crushed the Boxers brutally. The end of dynasties in China. The Qing dynasty was forced to pay massive financial penalties after losing the Boxer Rebellion. It finally completely collapsed in 1912, and a loose coalition of revolutionaries declared China to be a republic.